pleased to introduce Gary Lawrance, an architect from Stony Brook. So thank you for taking the ferry over to Connecticut.
Okay, thank you.
You're the author of Houses of the Hamptons, and you have an affinity for the Gilded Age. So that's what caught my eye when I was looking at a Facebook page, the Gilded Mansions. So let's go back to what got you to the Gilded Age and why you make these models, which we're going to see right in front of us or right down here. So you became an architect, and then what happened? You were making models for homes, is that correct?
Well, I think the Gilded Age is one of the reasons I became an architect, because as I was mentioning before, I think as I was a child, I was always interested in building houses. I had every building set that my parents could buy.
So Lincoln Logs and things like that?
Lego came out in the 60s, and it was very primitive then. There were like 2 types of blocks. And
I remember that.
And so I was always building, and I just ended up building castles. And I'd see old houses in magazines and books, and I tried to recreate the Beverly Hillbillies mansion because, as a child,
a kid, you
I
did
was
that
fascinated by that.
From watching TV.
And even Lyndhurst in Tarrytown, which is a museum house right now, I did that in Legos. And so I just always, and when I was 6 or 7 years old, and people said, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" I wanted to be an architect, and I didn't have anybody in the family who were architects, but it just sort of, I just knew what I wanted to be when I was going to grow up. And all my life, I collected and researched. My father worked in the city, and he'd bring back the papers in the 60s, and I'd be reading about all the Gold Coast mansions being torn down or auctioned off or burning.
You must have been horrified.
And so I had to start a scrapbook, a collection. I would clip, all these articles about all these great old houses.
So did that include the Hamptons and Newport?
The Hamptons and
wherever?
Newport and Fifth Avenue. And like I said, and even seeing some of these houses, like Lyndhurst was about the Jay Gould family. And then what I did is, maybe I was 12 or something, I got the biography on the Gould family, and in the back was a bibliography, where I went through and almost took out every book in the library on the Vanderbilts, the Astors, all the society books. And thank God I read them at 15, because I don't know if I had the time now to read them all. But and it's amazing how I've retained the knowledge of what Mrs. Astor maybe had for breakfast 100 years ago. It's like so.
And the Vanderbilts.
Yes.
So you become an architect, but you are building models of big homes.
Well, what happens when you go to architecture school? You usually work as an intern for an architecture firm. And I did that when I was going to school for the Spectra Group. They're on Long Island. They were a very big firm, but they're still around. They're still a big firm. And students tend to do models because they don't know what to give them. And I liked making models. And then when I graduated, I continued to work. I had my first job at the office, because you also need to work for an architect for 3 years to get your license. And I just love doing models. And they often ask me, you don't want to be, put into a little niche of just making models. I said, no, I like making models. And to me, it was a creative, artistic thing that I did. So, I did draft. I didn't really like draft. I did all the other sort of drafting dirty work that a young,
Sure.
intern does. But and actually in those days, I was doing very large corporation buildings that the firm did. And not so many house models, but when I went on my own in the early 90s, that's when the big house boom took. And everybody was building the so-called McMansions, and the Hamptons was just exploding with these big houses. And Nassau County had torn all those great mansions down, but then they were trying to build new sort of like replicas.
So 10 and 12 and 15,000 square feet and up.
Yes.
This house that we're looking at in front of us is a model that you did. And tell me where this house is.
This house is in Southampton, and it was originally built about the 1890s for the Barber family. And it's funny how, like I said, getting back to this, the models also, my interest in that led to sort of the book somewhat, really, because I loved the Hamptons. I had the research. I have a friend, an architect, Ann Searchin, who likes writing, and we got together, and I said, "You want to do it?" And she said, "Yeah, we'll do it."
Why not, right?
And because the book was offered to me from my publisher. When someone offers you a book, you really don't turn it down.
No, you don't. So when I look at this, there's a lot of X-Acto knife work going on here, to the shrubberies, to the iconic car in front of it. How long does it take you to make one of these?
I would say, well, also depends how fast you need it and how much you're willing to spend. But
and we should say this one costs about...
This is about $7,000 if I was to replicate it today. And probably 4 weeks if I really was working on it just by itself.
And you have built models that cost the owner
up to $20,000.
$20,000.
Yes. But they have landscaping, they have the formal gardens, they have pool houses, they have the water, they have the cliffs, so they get very big. They can be almost 6 feet long.
So you say when you're building a $20 or $30 million home, this is kind of a trophy for the owner because they have this displayed in their home.
It is an artwork, and like I said, let's just say you were working with an architect, and you might be very sophisticated in many other things, but you look at drawings and even computer models, it's still on the screen, and your architect might say to you, I think you could use a model. And then they would call me or you'd call me, and you see this model that would be made of your new proposed home, and you say, oh, I really get it now. I didn't really know what I was going to be doing and what the house was going to look like. So you can pick this up and hold it in front of you and get close to it.
It's 3D.
Yes, and in many ways, we look at models, and most people look at them from above the air where you would never see a house unless you're flying. I mean, here you can actually put it up to your face and look
It's
at the
amazing,
windows.
and even if I can turn this around
You
a
can
little
turn
bit,
it,
let's
yes.
see if
It's paper, and it's very light, actually.
It is light, but there's another side to it too, which is the back of this house, which is just as ornate.
This is actually why the model was commissioned. There's an architecture firm, Fleetwood and McMullen in East Hampton. They do a lot of wonderful, beautiful houses in the Hamptons. And this was, like I said, a historic house that was built in the Hamptons.
And this was an
1890.
addition, right? And
So,
that's
so the
why-
model was really done to add on this porch, plus also renovate the whole house, because it needed a lot of work, because it had been a show house and empty for quite a few years. And then they added that porch because in the old days, the kitchens were a place where the members of the family never went. And the
Oh,
lady
for heaven's sake, why would you ever
and
want
the
to go
lady of
there?
the house, like I said, we were from a Downton Abbey, and if the Countess would have to go in the kitchen, it would just never happen.
No, of course not.
Just like you and I would never go into the kitchen of the Plaza Hotel if we had a problem. It was like, so,
How many of these have you made, Gary?
people have asked me, and I had a big exhibit in Southampton 2 years ago, and it's got to be close to 1,000. I'm sure.
1,000 of these?
Yes. I mean, they're not all as detailed as this. I mean, sometimes they're very simple massings where, the walls are walls, and you take the windows from a drawing like a stamp, and you cut it out and paste it on. So that would be, let's say, a starter model, if you want to call it. This would be more my high-end model.
Did you ever think that all these many years down the road from being an architect, that this would really be your bread and butter? This is what you're doing on top of writing books.
Well, it's funny. It's when I was working in an architecture office, and I pretty much work exclusively with architects, and they'd all, say to me, "How do you do it? It takes so much patience." And I'd say to myself, "How do you sit at a drafting table on a drawing?" Because to me, I like the freedom of a model. To me, it's like I feel like I'm creating artwork. If you're, a draftsperson or an architect working in an office, you're working in a house for a year or two. And people say, I have such patience. I say, I really don't have much patience at all. I need a new job every 3 or 4 weeks because I want to go on to something else.
So you get bored.
I do get bored. So to me, and they're like artworks when they're done.
Oh,
And I
absolutely.
get satisfaction, and all the clients love them. And so you feel you've created something. I mean, a house, ultimately, when it's done, yes, it's a great deal of satisfaction. But by the time you get there, it's like 2 or 3 years later, and it's just like,
Your love for the Gilded Age. So I picked out two favorite places, and one of them is called the Four Fountains, which is an Art Deco splendor to me. I mean, this is amazing. You write about this house, and what was it known for?
Well, it was originally built as a studio building. And when people ask me about, favorite houses in the book, I would first think, well, of course, I like the biggest, most elaborate houses when I started. But seeing this house, it's still privately owned, and being there, taking pictures, being there for a day or two, it's really all you need. I mean, it's.
Well, this is a movie set. I pointed
Yes.
out to you this picture right here. This is amazing. There's a stage in the house. The money that was out in the Hamptons and still out in the Hamptons is amazing. And there's another house that I picked out, and it's called The Shallows. Tell me about this house.
Well, this is more of a true sort of like modernist house. It's at the end of the book, because we start with shingle style houses, Victorian houses, and the book kind of goes up to about approximately the 1930s, and it's almost the end of the so-called Gilded Age era, especially in the Hamptons. And this was built on the foundation of an older shingle style house that had burned, and of course usually people want to build on the foundation because they don't want, the Hamptons is all about being in by Memorial Day. And that was
Oh, for heaven's sakes, can you
Yes.
imagine not being there by
and
Memorial
being in the
Day?
Hamptons even today, when you're out there, let's say even now, it's amazing to see the trucks lined up. You can walk into a house right now and go back on Memorial Day, and it's like it's always been there. Millions of trucks coming with flowers. The lawns are rolled out with all the sod. All the furniture's put in. I mean, it's like a Hollywood set, all these houses being put together. And even now with a recent recession, well, the Hamptons is back full steam. So.
Now, you also write about Newport. You blog, you write, you have a Facebook page. You talk about Gatsby's Mansions, Gilded Age Gardens, Houses of the Hamptons, Lost Houses, which I find interesting, Mrs. Astor's Fifth Avenue. And you're able to speak and go to places and talk about all this knowledge that you've taken in over all these many years. So you're a speaker, you're writing books, you're doing models. Life is full for you.
Yes, it is. And it's kind of nice that it's all things I've always loved.
And you're also going to write a new book.
Yeah, I'm working on a book, Houses of Palm Beach. And it's kind of, it's like why I picked that one, because it's almost Palm Beach is really the Hamptons in the winter. It's funny talking about Newport. People who know the Gilded Age, Newport was considered the so-called queen of resorts. And when you mention Newport anywhere in the world, in 1890, 1900, and you said Newport, people thought the rich and famous, Mrs. Astor. It was just like
summer cottages.
The name, but you just thought Newport. You thought great wealth and mansions and palaces. And today, while Newport is still popular, and certainly from a tourist point of view, but it's but when you can go to India or China and say, well, you know, I live in the Hamptons or Southampton. Oh, the Hamptons, tell me more about it, really.
Interesting.
You know, and it's funny because the Hamptons is now the lights on the Hamptons. The Hamptons actually in the 1890s was a quiet place where people got away from, to get away from Newport, which was so formal. And I mean, you get into Newport's social history, it was, and the Gilded Age, and getting back to Downton Abbey, a lady had to wear something different in the morning, then change for lunch, and then change for cards, and change for dinner, and then have lots of lawn dinners and card games and tennis, and even our book was called...
Society was exhausted.
I know, and the book, actually the book, Houses of the Hamptons, was part of a series of books that the publisher did called The Architecture of Leisure.
And we can just go through some of the pictures that are inside the book, the ones that I didn't show you. There's one of your models. In fact, I picked out some other models that we don't see here. Here's a shingle-style house.
These are all new houses, built in about the past 5 or 10 years.
Here's another one. This is the modern one.
That's a modern. There's still a lot of modern. Actually, modern's become very popular again.
And so these are some of the, you know, the 20,000 or the 100,000. Or you said you've made 1,000 of them.
Yes, definitely. Probably, if I counted more or less, probably even more. Actually,
that's amazing to me.
I've been doing it for, I guess, 30 years. So.
Just ending on one story of the Gilded Age. When you talk about, when you go to speak about this, give me one story that maybe we don't know about the Gilded Age.
There's so many houses, just so much to know. It's
a house, a person, something that happened.
Well, I think the idea is there's a great house which most people don't know about, and really, if people ask me what's my favorite house of the Gilded Age, it might be a house that was called White Marsh Hall outside of Philadelphia. And it was a beautiful, splendid palace. It was about 1920s it was built. It's almost the epitome of everything that the Gilded Age was. It wasn't overly ornate. It was huge. It had very formal French gardens. It was very elegant. It was almost on the verge of modern where, look, I could live there today. I'm sure most people could. I mean, living in the breakers in Newport, well, it is, you know, it's a different lifestyle. They are almost like museums because there's a different way that those houses were designed.
Oh, absolutely.
But White Marsh Hall was a beautifully elegant, sort of French-style, Georgian-style, elegant house. And it's too bad we don't have a picture of it, but it's all over the internet. Type White Marsh Hall and you'll find it. And I think when people built these houses, maybe they thought they might last forever, or maybe I've come to think that people really are so upset that these houses have been torn down and torn down all the time. And I've almost come to think of some of these Gilded Age mansions that maybe they were built just to be party houses, like a party tent to set up. You have a great wedding or a party on your lawn, and it's beautiful with the flowers, and then the next day it's all gone again. And I think people built these houses sometimes, I mean, some were endowed, like the Frick collection in New York.
So much money was spent on these
but
houses.
I think they didn't think, and actually the funny thing is, many of these great houses were built by men who probably were in their 60s at that time, which actually that time would be quite old. And some of them lived quite a long, but some didn't last very long.
So this was their last hurrah. They built it as,
Yes,
it's almost an homage to what they did in their
So
lives.
the White Marsh Hall was built for the Stotesbury family, Edward Stotesbury and Ava Stotesbury, and they lived it up. And it was all about getting into society. Mrs. Stotesbury really wasn't accepted by Philadelphia society. We can digress into society and being in New York with Mrs. Astor. But the idea is if you want to be in society and be recognized, you build a beautiful house that's phenomenally expensive. I mean, there's an interesting story about the Woolworths in Southampton, but we may not get into that. But it's just that they made a big impact. And it was almost to the point where society almost has to accept them. And of course, then they went to Palm Beach and built another great mansion there. Then they had another great mansion in Bar Harbor. And they just had all these houses, and they just lived it up. You know, the Depression came, some of the money went, it came back, but then Mr. Stotesbury died in the 30s. And then Mrs. Stotesbury really couldn't afford all these enormous houses. And she eventually had to settle for just a Palm Beach house. And her friend loaned her a house in Washington that she could live, one of the Dodge, heiresses, But unfortunately, White Marsh Hall became a hideous ruin in the 80s and was demolished.
Which happens over and over again.
The Palm Beach house was destroyed in the 50s, and the Bar Harbor house was taken down probably in the 50s also, and now it's a ferry, ramp. And so there's a great family that most people may have heard of the Astors or the Vanderbilts, but whoever heard of the Stotesburys, and the legacy they left behind has really vanished. So there you have people who are very, very powerful and very rich and, are well known for their era, but their memory is really totally gone. So.
Interesting story. Gary Lawrance, thank you so much for coming over on the ferry from Long Island to talk to us.
Okay, enjoyed being here.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.